unique message, as this most of mine are not. I always prepare my message early in the week. Usually I try to get it done Sunday, Monday, the latest, because I don't want to get caught up in a busy week and make it difficult. I want to do it and just focus on that and take care of it. And on last Sunday or Monday, I don't remember what the work party, which day I put together a message on biblical prayer. And as I got into the week, God said, no, that's not it, which he does to me on occasion. Then Joni started asking if I was ever going to send her a list for the computer. And I didn't answer because I didn't know what I was going to do, frankly. And at the prayer meeting last night, I shared with the Erev Shabbat prayer group that I was troubled about some things. And then after we talked and we prayed together, I realized that's the wrong focus. It's actually, I'm concerned. I'm not troubled, I'm concerned because I see it. I know it's coming. And in our discussions in prayer during the last Erev Shabbat prayer, I realized it's not that I'm troubled by this. I'm very deeply concerned for this. I'm concerned for this because those people that are paying attention, God is speaking into all of us about the danger of missing it. As my bride, who is now back in town, told you, her study in Hebrew. We need to desire God. And as I said earlier, I think that was earlier today, or I don't know, it was last night, that don't forget that the people that left, God redeemed out of Egypt, died in the wilderness. Was that today or last night? That was today. Good. That means you heard it. My days run together. And so the message that I have, which I'm not sure where it's going to go, God gave me the scripture. It wasn't a scripture, so I added up another chapter. It's in 2 Kings chapters 6 and 7, if you want to open your Bibles. And it's an odd scripture. It's an odd story. And it's couched in the concept, if you read all of chapter 6 of 2 Kings, Aram was at war with Israel. And every time Aram tried to do something, the prophet, how do you say Elisha in English? Elisha, not Elijah. Elisha was the prophet. And every time the king of Aram tried to do something, the prophet would tell the king, they're gathering here, they're gathering there, they're doing this, they're moving here. And they were always ambushed, no matter what they tried, that really upset the king. He had that exchange, and they all surrounded the prophet, and then God blinded them all. He led them all into the capital, and then they got their sight back, and they realized they're all going to die. Because they put there, and the king said, "No, let them." The prophet told the king, "Just let them go home. They know better." And as soon as that happens, the next thing is the rest of chapter 6, beginning in verse 24. Now, this is just after they were sent home, after they had been trapped once again by the prophet Elisha. Now, it came to pass after this, after they learned their lesson, that King Ben-Hadad of Aram gathered his army and marched against Samaria and besieged it. So once again, the king of Aram decided he would go and besiege the capital city of Samaria. It's the kingdom of Israel, not the kingdom of Judah, okay? It's that point in history. And it's a capital city on the mountain in Samaria. And he besieged the city. And after a time of God intervening in a great way, and we finally had peace. God had watched over us. God had carried us through a time of threats where he intervened continually on our behalf, where he showed us great favor all of a sudden we're under siege. Under siege means if you are in a walled city, if somebody surrounds the walled city, you're stuck. And you can't get outside the walled city into what is called the air. The air means you're not in a walled city. The air means you're in an unwalled section. If you're in a city, it means you're within walls. Now, the walls protect you from invading armies, but if the invading army manages to surround the city, you have a problem because the only supplies you have are what you have within the walled city. And that's a difficult position. And because they're outside the city, they have all kinds of supplies, where inside the city, you run out of supplies reasonably quickly. And the next verse, verse 25, explains, now there was a great famine in Samaria since they were besieging it. There's a great famine. They simply ran out of food. You run out of food, you run out of water, depending on your water source, it gets bad. Until a donkey's head sold for 80 pieces of silver. That's the meat. A donkey's head, not prime. And a quarter of a cob, that's about a quarter of an ounce of dove's dung. That is, the dung of doves was used for both fertilizer and fire. There's a whole history of that in places like Masada and stuff like that. One of the most famous stories, I think they made a movie about the dung keeper in Masada. Famous part of the history about the doves. If you ever in Masada, you can go into where the pigeon coop was. And that's where they got fertilizer, and that's what they used to kindle fires. And 5 pieces of silver for an ounce of dung to start a fire to cook your donkey head. Okay? That's called living in difficult times. After a time of favor where God was blessing us and protecting us. And I want you to see that. God was with us. The prophet Elisha was watching over us, intervening for us. And he kept the enemy at bay, the enemy Aram. And then all of a sudden, we're being besieged. Now, Elisha is still the prophet. But rather than God using the prophet to make intervention to keep Aram at bay, the prophet is silent. And the city is besieged, and it is very hard times. And I want you to grasp that you can go through a season where God is with you, God is intervening on your behalf, God is watching over you, God is keeping you, and then all of a sudden, bang, times are bad. Times are bad, and they get really hard. These are difficult times. And it's a great famine. It's a great famine because you can't do anything to break the famine. You can't go outside the wall and sow a crop or go foraging or go hunting. It's a really difficult time. Verse 26. And as the king of Israel is passing on the wall, a woman cried out to my lord, the king, help. Now, all walled cities have a rampart, and you can walk around the wall. The last time I was in Jerusalem with my 2 grandsons that aren't here today, Isaiah and Joshua, among the things we did is we got up and walked all the way around the walls of Jerusalem. We circumvented the walls of Jerusalem. Just because we wanted to do some fun things. I don't know how many times we'll be in Jerusalem. That's one of the things. So the king's walking around the wall. It's not easy to get up on the wall because it's up on the wall. There is not many entrance points. The entrance points tend to be around the gates, depending on how many gates there are. And you're going to go up, and the king's up just walking around the wall. Now, he's walking around the wall, and what he sees on this side of the wall is the army of Aram surrounding him. And the city is in desperate shape. He's the king. He's the king. Elisha's the prophet, but it's like all of a sudden Elisha's not doing anything. And you have to see that. Because in this one chapter, the first half of the chapter, God is using the prophet Elisha to keep the army of Aram at bay. And it's just a simple story of Elisha revealing all the plans of Aram to Israel and keeping them at bay. And suddenly, they changed. Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, changes his mind, comes and besieges the city. Now the king's walking around the wall and the prophet's nowhere to be seen. And all of a sudden, God's not showing us favor. Because times are difficult in this city, very difficult. So a time where God is watching over you, keeping you, blessing you, and keeping the enemy at bay. In a paragraph, without explanation, changes, and things are worse than they have ever been. The prophet has disappeared, and the king's walking around the walls of the city that is dying on the inside because of a tremendous famine. And there's a woman down there in the city that cries out and says, "My Lord, the king, help." In the next verse, verse 27, he said, "If Adonai doesn't help you, how would I help you, from the threshing floor or from the winepress? My Lord the king, help. What am I going to do? You want me to get help from the threshing floor or the winepress? They're both empty. If God's not going to help you, if Adonai's going to help, what do you want me to do? Go to the threshing floor for you? You want me to go to the wine press for you? That's things I can do, but the trouble is, they're both empty. What do you want me to do? If God's not going to do something, because you remember at the beginning of the chapter, he was taking care of us through the holy man Elisha. Now he's no longer taking care of us, and Elisha's nowhere to be seen. What do you want me to do? God's not helping. I can do what you can do. I can go to the threshing floor. I can go to the wine press. But we all know it's empty. If God's not going to help, what do you want me to do? What do you, I'm a typical politician, you know? I should pay some attention to my notes. Next week I have to pay attention to my notes because I told Sam that I'd use notes so he could learn how to give notes without looking like you're using notes. And here's the key. I don't use any notes, but I do this a little bit more often than you do. Then the king does what any politician does. In the next verse, he asks her a question. What's the matter with you? Yeah, what's the matter with you? You want me to help? God doesn't help. What do you want me to do? What's the matter with you? Why would you ask? And she answered, this woman said, give me your son so that we may eat him today and we eat my son tomorrow. That's hard times. So what happened down in the city where there's an absolute famine, these two mothers get together, who probably had teenage sons. And you have to have raised teenage sons to understand that. And so let's make a deal. We'll cook your son. And then tomorrow we'll cook my son. You can only do that to a teenager. I mean, I make light of it, but that's from the first half of the chapter where the king of Aram says, somebody's sleeping in my bedroom and knows everything I'm thinking. What's going on here? We can't do anything. We get ambushed. And that's what he actually said. Who's been staying in my bedroom listening to my thoughts? Then all of a sudden, things are so bad, the two mothers make a deal. Let's cook your son today, we'll cook my son tomorrow. Now this is a king who just asked, what's the matter with you? God's not going to help, what do you want me to do? Well, here's how we solve the problem. And they make a deal. And the problem is the deal. And the next verse says, the problem is, we cooked my son and ate him. The next day I told her, give me your son that we made him. May eat him, but she hid her son. So things are so bad, two mothers get together and say, we'll eat my son today, your son tomorrow. And they eat the first son. The next day they're full because they've had something to eat. But the deal falls through. The deals fall through because sometimes, very often in the world, people make dubious deals with one another. And when one person does it, the other person takes it and runs, which is what happens here. But you have to remember, she's talking to the king. The king's up on the wall. He's flustered. What do you want me to do? You know, I can go to the grocery store for you. The shelves are bare for me as well as they are for you. He said, well, here's the issue. We made a deal. Now, this is a horrible deal. But it's the king who's asking, what do you want me to do? And they want him to fix the deal they made. And the king is absolutely not only worthless, he is helpless. How's he going to fix that? He can't fix that. And so in the next verse, that when he heard the words of the woman, he tore his clothes. We had a funeral. Was that yesterday? My days blur sometimes. And I did a kariah with the family where you tear a kariah ribbon. And somebody asked me last night, I don't know who, because they hadn't seen it. Don't worry about who it was. And I didn't have it. But see, historically, when you go in mourning, you tear your clothes over your heart. It's a sign of mourning. You tear your clothes. We become civilized. We put a ribbon on that we tear instead of our clothes. I'm not saying that's good. I say it's the way it is. I don't even know where I am. I'll just follow you. I won't follow my notes because I don't have any. People looked, behold, he had sackcloth underneath on his flesh. In other words, when he tore his clothes, they noticed he was wearing sackcloth underneath his tunic. The reason you wear sackcloth, it's one of the ways of when you're kind of desperate for something from God and you have a hard time focusing on him because of the distraction of desperation, the distraction of silence, and the fact that you grow very weary of the nothingness of the world and you can't really focus on God. One of the ways you focus on God is put on what they call here sackcloth, burlap. And it scratches and it itches all the time. And then no matter how you feel, you're reminded that you're not hearing from God. In relationship with people who believe in God, that's why you put on sackcloth. It's a time of desperation. And you're so desperate, you need a constant reminder of how desperate you are for God. And if you put on burlap, it doesn't matter if anyone else sees it, you're going to feel it all the time. It's always scratching. It's always itching. And you can't do anything about it because if you scratch it, it gets worse. Because sackcloth. So he has sackcloth under, and the people saw it. He can't do anything, and he knows he can't do anything. And the sign that he can't do anything is he's wearing sackcloth. And he has to give an answer to this problem. He's the king. And he said, what do you want me to do? And here's what we want you to do. We want you to fix this deal we made. And the first thing you can see is a picture like, I'm not hearing from God. I can't do anything. And Elisha's gone. So what's the proper reaction to this? The next verse, may God do so to me and even more if the head of Elisha, the son of Shaphat, remains on him today. She ate your son and today she won't give him her son. I know how to fix this. Let's kill the prophet. Where's the man of God? See, the man of God kept us safe from the armies of Aram for the first half of this chapter. I'm sure that's what he's thinking. And all of a sudden, we have this, the situation couldn't be worse. Where's the prophet? Where's the guy that God used to keep Aram at bay? God has abandoned us, and it's the holy man's fault. Because the holy man is our connection to God. And you're talking about eating one of their sons. May God so to me if the head of Elisha remains on him today. I know how to fix this. Let's kill the holy man. Because the holy man didn't bail us out. In the first half of the chapter, the holy man kept all this at bay. And now it's worse than it has ever been. Where's the holy man? And it's a picture of people that are the people of God, that God intervenes in your life and God shows you favor and God is blessing you and watching over you and keeping you. And all of a sudden, you're besieged and things get bad, real bad. Sometimes they can get really bad, because as bad as it can be for all of us, it's never been that bad, where we're arguing over whose son to eat. And the king says, wait, you know what the whole problem is? May God be so to me. In other words, let everybody eat me. If the head of Elisha, the son of Shaphat, remains on him today. You know what we got to do? Kill the holy man. It's the holy man's fault. It's the holy man's fault because we relied on the holy man. We relied on the holy man. There are a lot of people that come through this congregation. I get emails, texts, phone calls for people who are long gone. But when the rubber meets the road and life gets challenging, they get a hold of me because we need the holy man to fix this. And a lot of us go through times where there's a crisis. Where's the holy man? God used the holy man to keep us safe. And this is what's happening here. For half a chapter, God keeps the enemy at bay through the prophet. Now the enemy is here. Let's kill the prophet. So where is the prophet? Where is the prophet during this time? All of a sudden, he's gone from, revealing the king's thoughts in his bedroom and keeping Aram at bay. Now he's nowhere. Is he? The next verse, he's sitting in his house. He's sitting at home. Where's the holy man? What's the holy man doing? He's doing what holy men sometimes do. He's sitting down. He's at home. And the elders were sitting with him. Now the city is going to hell. The city is as bad as it's ever been. And the prophet who in the first half of the chapter kept the armies of Aram at bay is sitting in his house with his elders. And they're kibbutzing. They're sitting in the house. Who knows what they're doing? It's like, don't they realize that there's a siege? And the king, who remember wanted his head before the nightfall, had sent a messenger ahead. The king's going to come have his head cut off. He sends a messenger to make sure he's home because he hasn't seen him. Hard to cut off somebody's head when you don't know where they are. So he sends a messenger. Make sure he's sitting in his house because I want to cut off his head. And so while this tragedy is going on and God's no longer protecting the city, the king says, we need to cut off the holy man's head because he's not helping us anymore. He's sitting in his house, and this king sends a messenger ahead. And even before the messenger arrived, Elijah said to the elders, do you see this son of a murderer has sent to take away my head? So they're talking. He said, you know what's happening? The king's sending a messenger so he could take away my head. Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold the door fast against him. Is not the sound of his masters? So they're sitting there, footsteps behind him. Thank you, Joni. He's sitting in the house talking. The holy man's sitting in the house talking. Meanwhile, out in the city, things couldn't be worse. Couldn't be worse. It's collapsing. God's not there. Where's the holy man? Sitting in his house. And he speaks a word. You know, there's a messenger coming to the king. They want to find me, so they cut his head. When he comes knock on the door, ignore him. Just ignore him. Why would the holy man, who in the first half of the chapter did everything to protect us from the battles, the armies of Aram, be sitting in his house kibitzing with the elders of the other elders, that probably is a school of prophets that are with him? He said, the king's sending a messenger over. The messenger wants to make sure I'm here so his master can come cut off my head. When he knocks on the door, leave him out there. Leave him out there. And while he's yet talking to the people, the holy man, the prophet, who God had used to protect Israel in the first half of this chapter, and he's explaining to them, there's a messenger coming. The messenger came down to him. The king, who is the king, who sent the messenger, said, look, this evil is from Adonai. What should I wait for Adonai any longer? I've been waiting for God long enough. I'm not going to wait for God anymore. I want to cut off the head of the holy man because it's the holy man's fault. We relied on the holy man to keep us safe. And now the holy man has disappeared. And what do you do when the holy man disappeared? Then your world falls apart. King's fed up. This evil comes from God. It's God's fault. Why should I wait from God any longer? I should flip and see where I'm going, as if it matters. Why should I wait for God any longer? You get to the point in your life where you're absolutely beside yourself. And I could tell you from the communication I get for the people who have taken offense at me, it's one of the things I'm going to talk to Beit Yeshua about this afternoon, our guys out at Beit Yeshua. You could take offense with one another, which is a sin. But that won't drive you away. If you take offense with me, you might as well leave because you're stuck. And while some people leave for legitimate reasons, most people leave for the wrong reason. The holy man has let them down and God's not helping them anymore, and it's my fault. See, it's my fault God's not blessing you and you're going through a crisis. That's what the king is thinking. God's not doing anything. Why should I keep waiting for God when the holy man's sitting in his house? I'm sick of this. So now, all of a sudden, after all this time, when Elisha has been sitting in his house while everything goes to pot, he gets a word to speak to the messenger to give to the king. Next verse is 2 Kings 7, verse 1. So he said to the messenger who's standing on the other side of the door. Okay? He didn't let him in. He said, hear the word of the Lord of Adonai, or hear the word of Adonai. Thus says Adonai, tomorrow about this time a measure of fine flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. Well, the whole problem is the famine. The holy man's missing in action. He hasn't been doing anything. And everything has gotten as bad as it could possibly be. And the messenger is coming to make sure he's home so the king can come chop off his head. I didn't go back one. Thank you, Joni, because I don't know where I'm going, but I'm stuck here for a moment. And he talks to the door and he says, I hear the word of Adonai. Now I have a word. And I'll speak into the famine. Tomorrow about this time, a measure of fine flour was sold for a shekel and 2 measures of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. Now remember, we've been raffling off a donkey's head and the dung of a dove. And now all of a sudden, a shekel for 2 measures of barley, a measure of barley for 2 measures of, just a shekel. All the barley, all the flour, all the barley you could want at the gate. Small city, probably my opinion is only one gate. It's been destroyed, so I don't know. I haven't been there. But all of a sudden, the prophet gets a word. The prophet, for the first part of the chapter, said the army's setting up an ambush here. The army's setting up an ambush here. And just kept everything. And then all of a sudden, he's in his house and he disappears. The army comes, sieges, and the city goes down, and there's nothing to eat. Nothing to eat. Nothing to eat. And he says, I have a word. Tomorrow, you're going to have more than enough food. Okay? Now, that's the interesting word to a city that's under siege, and people are eating each other's children. And so in the next verse, verse 2, the officer on whose hand the king was leaning, in other words, this was the king's advisor, okay, responded to the man of God, said, look, King Adonai should make windows in heaven. Could this thing happen? Wait a minute. If God opened the windows of heaven, that couldn't happen. I can't take this message to the king. And the prophet said, I'll tell you what, you're going to see it with your own eyes, but you're not going to eat any of it. All of a sudden, the holy man's speaking again. And it's a message of hope. Oh, tomorrow, all the food you want. He said, that's impossible. That's impossible. That's not the answer we want. That's impossible. He says, I'll tell you what. You're going to see it, but you're not going to be able to eat any of it. Verse 3. 2, wherever I am. Where am I? Down there. 3, okay. Meanwhile, at the gate. The gate's important because the food's going to be at the gate. Okay? There are 4 men with solder at the entrance of the gate. 4 lepers sitting at the gate of the city. They can't come in the city because they're unclean. If they leave the city, there's an army besieging them. They're sitting outside the city at the gate. All right? And they're reasoning among themselves, why should we just sit here and die? After all, there is a famine inside the city. We can't get outside the city. We're sitting here so that they don't kill us, but we're going to sit here and die because there's a famine. They are unaware that inside there's exchange going on between the king, who is worthless and helpless, and the holy man who's been silent until he spoke and said, well, tomorrow this will all be taken care of, but you will see it but not eat any of it. So these lepers are sitting there, and they reason among themselves in the next verse, verse 4, and say, if we say let's go into the city, there's a famine on this city, so we'll die there. If they let us in the city, it's not going to help us because we're going to die there. If we sit here, we're going to die as well. So let's go into the camp of the Arameans. If they spare us, we'll live, and if they kill us, we'll die. That's a very logical thing. You know, I'm sitting here dying. If I go in this city, I'll die. If we stay here, we'll die. If we go there, we might die. You know, there's your 3 choices. Let's go into the camp. Worst case scenario is they'll kill us. You know? And if they don't kill us, we can get something to eat because they're not in famine. They're outside the city, right? They're out in the air. So it's a real logical thing. And in verse 5, they got up at twilight. Oh, there's a whole picture there. Twilight. Twilight. Why twilight? The only other time the twilight is mentioned in a significant place in the Bible is the Passover. Pesach happened at twilight. The word there, twilight. Just as the sun starts to set. Not completely set, starts to set. So at twilight, they go to the camp in the meeting. In other words, just as it starts to get dark, they go over to the camp. But when they arrived at the edge of the Armenian camp, behold, there wasn't anyone there. So you go at night, because if you go during the day, they're going to think you're Israelis and they're going to kill you before you get there because you've come to the city. If you go at night, they can't see you until you get there. And then who knows? If they spare us, we'll get something to eat. If they kill us, we're going to die anyway. They get together at the camp. There's no sentries out. There's no sentries out at the edge of the camp. And why were there no sentries? And the next verse explains, Adonai had caused the army of the Armenians to hear a noise of chariots and noise of horses. Indeed, the noise of a huge army. So they said to one another, look, the king of Israel has hired the kings of the Hittites and the king of the Egyptians to assault us. We're up against this one city, but there's an army coming out of us. They must have hired the Hittites and the Egyptians. This is a big army. This army is not from Israel. This is the combined army of the Hittites and the Egyptians. We're all of a sudden outnumbered, and they're coming after us in our camp. Verse 7, the next verse, they got up and fled at twilight, at that exact moment as the sun was setting, right? Their horses, abandoning their tents, their horses, their donkeys, the entire camp, just as it was, and they fled for life. They left everything and ran for their life because the Spirit of God had chased them out. And next verse 8, when the lepers, the 4 lepers who had gone at the edge of camp, they entered into one tent. All kind of stuff. They sit down, they eat, they drink. Took the silver, they took the gold, they took the clothes. Then they went and buried them in the sand. We could use these. Then they returned and went to another tent. And then they got another tent, and it's empty with all this stuff, and they take all this stuff. And they take it out, bury it in the sand. This is handy if you're a leper. You have a stash. Gold, silver, clothes, you know. These are big deals for lepers. And so you're burying things out in the sand where you know where it is. So you still have leprosy, but you have stuff now. And then in verse 9, they've eaten, they got all kind of stuff, and they said to one another, it's not right what we're doing. All of a sudden, they have a conscience. This day is of good news, and we're keeping it silent. The siege is broken. We didn't bother to tell anybody. We've been taking the spoils, but the city is still languishing. You know, this is a day of good news, and we're not saying anything to anybody. If we wait till morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now, let's go ahead and report to the king's household. So they're out there, they're eating, they're full, they have all this loot they buried, and they said, you know, if they find out tomorrow that the army left and we knew it and we didn't tell anybody, we'll get in trouble. You know, just thinking people. They're lepers, but they can think when the sun comes up, they might realize there's not besieged anymore and the army's gone. They come out and they said, we've been there all night looting. Then the king will be mad at us because we didn't tell him all night. We have to go back to the city and report this to the king's household. In other words, they can't approach the king. They can send a message to the king. Verse 10. So they came and called out to the city gatekeepers. They can't enter the city. They're lepers. So they call out to the gatekeepers and said, we went to the camp of the Armenians, and look, there was not a single soul, no human voice, just horses and donkeys tied up in the tents just as they were. So they want to get in trouble. after they had ate their fill, after they had looted. The people in the city are languishing. The man of God has finally spoke up and said, well, look, this time tomorrow, there's not going to be any kind of a famine. You can have all the food you want. And the messenger said, that's impossible. If God opened the windows of heaven, he couldn't do that. The king still wants the head of the holy man. The prophet said, siege ends tomorrow, you'll find out. They think, whoa, we got to go back. They call up to those gatekeepers. Hey, siege is over. All kind of stuff out there in the old camp, right? Verse 11, the gatekeepers called out and reported to the royal palace inside. In other words, they go through the chain of command from the wall to the officers to the household of the king. And bring the word from the lepers that the siege has ended and left everything behind. And the camp is full of stuff. And verse 12, when the king got up in the night, remember this happened in the nighttime. He said to his courtiers, let me tell you now what the Armenians have contrived against us. They know that we are hungry, so they went out of the camp to hide themselves among the field, thinking when they come out of the city, we'll capture them alive and get into the city. Aha, this is a trap. This is the worthless king who the prophet is not speaking to. All right, you have to see that. Prior to this, the first half, the prophet told the king, here's what you can do to keep them at bay. And all of a sudden, we're besieged. And the king had sent a messenger who was told, oh, this time tomorrow, it's over. I don't know if he told the king that or not. I'm not sure he passed the message on to the king because the king doesn't seem to aware of it. And he said, this is a trap. They pulled out of the camp to lure us out. Then they could take us prisoner and get the city. This is a trap because he still doesn't know what's going on. But his advisors that are with him in the next verse answered, please let some men take five of the remaining horses left in the city. There's only 5 left because they ate the rest of them. We have 5 horses left. They're just like the whole multitude left in it. They're just like the whole multitude of Israel. They're going to die too. We got 5 horses we haven't eaten. We can afford to send 5 guys on horses out because if they stay, we're going to eat them. Might as well at least send them out and see if it's true. Because there's that human logic. There's that political solution. Wait a minute, we have 5 horses we haven't eaten. We can send 5 guys on these 5 remaining horses out, or we can keep them here and we could eat them. And when we eat them, everybody in the city is going to die. Couldn't hurt to send 5 guys and 5 horses. If we lose them, we would have eaten them anyway, because ultimately we're all going to die anyway. Verse 14. So they took 2 chariots with the horses, and the king sent them to see after the army of the Armenians, and said, go and see. Okay, go and see. It's a idiom of spy out the land type kind of things. Go check it out. We can do this. Which, by the way, at this point in history, most people don't ride on horses. The horses pull the chariots for them. You can ride on horses, but it's better to have horses than chariots. And the messenger, you already moved from me. They went after them to the Jordan. They left Samaria and went all the way to the Jordan River. That's the border. You're out, if you've been on my tours, our first day is Judea and Samaria out there by Ariel. And then you have the river on that side, which is the border. So they went all the way to the border to make sure that they weren't laying in ambush for us to come out of the city. And all the way was strewn with clothes and equipment, which they had thrown away in their haste. In other words, we're running, and they realize this is slowing us down. They start throwing things off so they can run faster. And they go all the way to the river, all the way to the border, and the army has shed everything that was slowing them down in their haste. And they go back to the king and said, no, they're not laying an ambush. They ran for their lives. This is a good thing, right? Verse 16. So the people went out and ransacked the camp of the Armenians. That's a picturesque term. They ransacked the camp. They took everything. Everything. They took everything in the tent. They took the tent. They took the animals. They took the weapons. They took everything. They ransacked it. They brought in all the supplies. Then a measure of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel, just as the word of Adonai. And suddenly, overnight, the siege is over, and the word of God comes true. The word of God comes true. Although it's an odd timing, because God's timing is never really logical by our understanding. Because when things are at their worst and God is silent and you blame the holy man, all of a sudden the holy man says, well, siege is over tomorrow, everything's taken care of. And a measure of fine flour, a shekel, 2 measures of barley, a shekel, everything's taken care of, just like the holy man had said, right? Who did he tell? The messenger, right? Remember what he told the messenger? You'll see it, but you won't eat any of it. Why? The next verse. The king appointed the officer on whose hand he had leaned to have him put him in charge of the gate. This is his trusted guy. Stand at the gate. The people trampled him at the gate, and he died. Just as the man of God had said, and who spoke when the king came down to him. So he saw it. He didn't get to eat any of it. How did that work? He was put in charge of the gate, and the people knew there was food out there, and he got trampled to death. He saw it. He didn't eat it, just like the holy man had said. Just like the holy man had said. I need to see how many verses there are here because I don't know. This next verse just reminds you, for the man of God had spoken to him, 2 measures of barley for a shekel, a measure of fine flour for a shekel, will be tomorrow at this time, it was in the evening, at the gate in Samaria, verse 19. The officer had answered the man, look, even if Adonai should make the windows of heaven open, could such a thing happen? He said, behold, your eyes will see it, but you will not eat any of it. And this is so that you can grasp. I believe that this is a message that burdens all of us who were at the Erev Shabbat prayer meeting last night, felt the burden for Beth Messiah. God has done a great thing here. And all of a sudden, people are distracted because they don't understand why God let us dry up. And some of us, tied and associated with this kingdom center, have simply dried up. God doesn't seem to be doing anything. The man of God doesn't seem to be saying anything, and things are bad. Things are bad. We're completely unsure. Not as bad as it got in the siege of Samaria, but it's bad. Life is hard. A lot of the people that come Friday night drag in here. And a lot of you who came this morning drug yourself in here. It's not like you got up bright and early this morning and said, I have nothing else to do. I might as well go to Beth Messiah. No. You committed to come here. You had to get up. You had to wonder, how's the traffic going to be? Usually not as bad on Saturday mornings as other times. And so you overcome and you push your way to get here. You get here, you're kind of tired. You're kind of weary. And you want to feel better. You want to escape the world, which is okay. It's the Sabbath. We're supposed to escape the world. It's okay to come here to escape from the world because you're supposed to on the Sabbath. But the problem is sometimes you rely on the man of God instead of relying on God. And you wonder, why doesn't the man of God do something? Because I'm languishing. And the man of God, don't worry, God has it all under control. And it's like, no, I don't believe that. And I said, fine. You're going to see it, but you're going to die before you get any of it. You're not going to. Some of you are going to miss what God's doing with this work because you're too weary, you're too tired, you're too distracted to engage in what God is doing. The Hope Fest was 4 weeks ago. 575, mostly men, responded to an invitation to receive Messiah. In our neighborhood, 32 of them said, here's my address. Please have somebody come and talk to me. I want to know more about this. And this morning when I asked who was willing to do that, 2 people stood up and said, we'll do that. 2 people. God's doing something, and you're busy waiting for God to do something. And you say, well, I don't know. If God would open heaven, this kind of stuff isn't going to happen. I'm telling you, it's happening around us. And a lot of you have gone weary because we've had a significant move of God now since 2016. We're in 2021 after surviving 2020, and we're dragging through hoping things will get better. And I'm telling you, the harvest is white out there. God is moving. And you're waiting for the holy man to say something. And when he says something, it's not what you want to hear. And I'm telling you, it doesn't work the way we think it should work. Because if you ask the question, why in the middle of the chapter did the holy man start sitting in his living room and quit protecting the city, and the city goes downhill rapidly? You know what would happen? I know what would happen. If I came in here once, Shabbat, and said, I'm sorry, I don't have a message. Most of you love me enough to let me get away with that, and the reality is there's a couple guys in here would step up and give a message, even though they're not ready to give a message. That would happen because a lot of you really are engaged in ministry. That's why I had everybody stand up that was engaged. Everybody had stand up, with the exception of the team that was in there and didn't even know I was talking about them. A lot of people involved. You know, Ji Young had an appointment to get her phone fixed, so she came in early to set up the kitchen. And she's not here, but she'll come back in time for Oneg so she could serve. And what does she do? She controls Oneg for us. You know, Bill and Alan, who are in dire financial straits because of their health, have been tithing to this congregation since 1978. They have almost nothing, but I tell you, they by faith give 10% of their nothing to this. It's the widow's mite. Because they believe, they're faithful. And you say, well, and if you know, what can somebody? And if you, a lot of us know them because I said they've been here forever. 2 people who are in dire financial straits won't make or break the budget here. But I'm telling you, God sees what they do. And it's like the widow's mite. It's not what you give, it's your heart. And I'm telling you, don't let your heart grow weary. Don't go weary in doing well. Don't wait for God to do something. And above all things, don't pay attention to what God's not doing. Because too many people say, look at this, God's not doing something. Instead of paying attention to what God is not doing, pay attention to what God is doing. Look at the reality. God got over 500 people come to faith, and you can't help because you don't speak Spanish. But I said, look, if you can pray, you can team up with somebody who can speak Spanish, and you go 2 by 2, and you can stand on the sidewalk and pray for the Spanish speaker that goes up and knocks on the door. And some of you say, well, that's not easy. And God didn't come to make us comfortable. He came to make us holy. And I'm telling you, if we, as a kingdom center, do not serve the King and get busy about what God is doing, we're going to miss it. We're going to be like the people that came out of Egypt but died in the wilderness and couldn't attain the promise. And they were the people that God had redeemed miraculously by the holy man Moses. And I don't want that to be the epitaph of Beth Messiah. God did a great work for a few years before it died. Because I'm telling you, that is the danger of a people who are willing to become complacent. And I wanted to recognize a lot of people, because a lot of people are engaged in a lot of things that nobody sees what they're doing. Nobody knows everything that goes on here. Some of you, and some of you online that live close enough really are too busy to be too engaged in anything that God is doing, because you're busy focusing on what God is not doing. And you're sitting around saying, why doesn't the man of God say something? Why doesn't he give me a word? Doesn't he know that I'm weary and I'm beaten down and life is hard? Why doesn't the holy man reach out and say something? And I'm telling you, even if the holy man can stand up and say something, the message is not what you want to hear. And my burden is for all of us. What would happen if we reached out and only reached half of the people? The festival was 2 lots over across the street. The parking was next door, and the ministry came out of here. We were heavily engaged in this. If we reached half the people, we'd have 250 new believers. 250 new believers out of a congregation this size. We couldn't bring them all in here. We couldn't. But God gave them to us. Are you willing to be engaged? Are you willing to serve? Are you willing to go to the prison, to the DJJ, to a nursing home, to do something? I mean, just go out and help clear some bush so Larry could do more drainage. That's important. Go into the ringling room and you notice it's quieter. Why? Because there's soundproofing that has started to go up in that room. It wasn't angels. Believe me, I know these 2 guys. You know, it's Jeff and Bob. Obviously not angels. But you know, when you go in there today, pay attention. It's quieter than it has been. And they're not finished yet. I don't want to say we're not finished yet. The reality is, Bob isn't finished yet. Jeff's working behind the scenes building. Pay attention to what God is doing. And quit focusing on what God is not doing. Live by faith and live carefully. Be blessed, everybody. Shabbat shalom. Have a good own egg.